Cook, do you support the Chinese people's right to protest? Do you have any reaction to the factory workers that were beaten and detained for protesting COVID lockdowns?
Hey guys, I'm Andrew Invest, and that was part of the worst 45 seconds of Tim Cook's career. Approached by journalists in Washington at the end of last year, I think it's a really revealing interaction because the journalists asked some very piercing and direct questions about Apple's relationship to China. And Tim Cook is kind of forced to remain submissive, meek, silent, because he doesn't want to risk the wrath of Beijing. I think a lot of investors are not realizing the true scale of the risk posed to Apple from China. And in this video, I want to elucidate upon that. Now, don't get me wrong. I am heavily invested into Apple. It's my second biggest holding, and I have a lot of faith in the business model. I thought that Warren Buffett's recent comments on the company at the Berkshire Hathaway AGM were very telling. Let's go ahead and listen to them right now.
And Apple is a better business. Our railroad is a very good business, but it's not remotely as good as Apple's business. Apple, has a position with consumers where they're paying, maybe they pay $1,500 or whatever it may be for a phone, and these same people pay $35,000 for having a second car. And if they had to give up a second car or give up their iPhone, they'd give up their second car. I mean, it's an extraordinary product. We don't have anything like that we own 100% of.
What Warren is speaking about here is the moat of the brand value of Apple and also the affluence of a typical Apple consumer. Both of these are great reasons to invest in the company, and I'm fully behind that thesis. And yet, when Warren Buffett is later asked about his investment in TSMC, the Taiwanese chip-making company, he states that it's a great business on so many levels, but he decided to withdraw from it because he doesn't like the risk, i.e. the risk of China invading Taiwan. Let's go ahead and listen to that now.
Taiwan Semiconductor is one of the best managed companies and important companies in the world. And there is not, and I think you'll be able to say the same thing 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. I don't like its location, and I've reevaluated that.
Apple currently derives around 20% of its annual revenue from China, whilst also manufacturing over 90% of its goods there. That means the company faces a unique risk if China was to invade Taiwan. Just look at what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. Multiple Western companies were forced to withdraw their businesses from Russia, either by public pressure or governmental sanctions. If that same thing were to happen to Apple in China, it would be a complete disaster for the company. There's not to mention the fact that almost all of Apple's chips are created in Taiwan for them by TSMC. So the company is not completely blind to the fact that it's over-relying on China and there's a huge amount of risk involved there. It's trying to diversify away from the country for its manufacturing needs, but it's a slow process. Other than China, Apple's main manufacturing hubs are in Vietnam and India. Its most ambitious plans are for India, where it will work with a swathe of partners to make iPhones, AirPods, and Apple Pencils. Apple produced more than 6.5 of the 200 million iPhones it made in 2022 in India. It aims to produce 10 million units there in 2023. So that's still a diminutive amount in comparison to the number made in China. It's only around 5% of global production this year. People involved in the process believe that that number could exceed 15 million units in 2024. Some think Apple could move as much as 25% of iPhone production to India by 2025 if it sticks to the most aggressive timeline. I think that those expectations are extremely unlikely. When you look at the current growth in production in India, it's around 50% per year. And if it were to stick to that number, it would be around 20 million units by 2025, whereas 25% would have to be 50 million units. So that's very, very optimistic. As we also saw, there have been a number of quality issues with products produced in Vietnam and India as compared to China. And that's because it's not only cheap labor that makes Apple produce its goods in China in the first place, it's also because of the high education levels in the workforce. It really helps with these kind of things. If we delve a little bit deeper into Apple's quality issues in Indian factories, we can see some pretty shocking findings. So at this recently built casings factory in Hosur, India, 1 in every 2 components coming off the production line is basically too bad to be sent on to Apple's assembly partner. That's really, really bad, especially when compared to Apple's goal for 0 defects. I'm willing to bet that the Chinese factories have a far lower failure rate. In China, suppliers and government officials took a whatever-it-takes approach to win iPhone orders. Former Apple employees described instances which they would estimate a certain task might take several weeks only to show up the next morning to find it already completed at inexplicable speed. Operations in India are not running at that sort of pace, said a former Apple engineer briefed on the matter. There just isn't a sense of urgency. So I think that betrays a lot of truth in the sense of cultural issues and potentially educational issues with the country just not being up to the same standards as China. We can also see contract manufacturers would frequently claim that they can fulfill any need for an electronics client, but in reality, they would be slow to respond to customer concerns after the deal is signed and lack flexibility to respond to changes. The Apple engineers have also at times been housed in city centre hotels in Chennai, the capital of the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu, 2 hours away from the factories where they are working. This requires 4 hours of daily commuting with occasionally poor Wi-Fi connections along the route. That's really bad infrastructure as well. So there's so many different factors, meaning that India is extremely unlikely to replace China as Apple's main factory hub within the next couple of decades, most likely. But even if Apple is able to reduce its reliance on China for production, it won't be able to fully remove all production from China, and it will have to leave a sizable chunk there. Why? Because of China's capital controls. China has a very strict capital control regime, which basically means it's extremely difficult for a company or an individual to withdraw yuan from the country and convert it into dollars. If we quickly use the UK as comparison, if Apple is to make £1 billion in revenue in the UK, it's very easy for the company to convert those pounds into dollars, send them back to the US, and then reinvest them or do stock buybacks or pay a dividend with those profits. Whereas if they make that same amount of money in China in yuan, it's much easier for them to reinvest that money back into the business, into factories and paying workers to produce iPhones rather than withdrawing it from the country because it's such a difficult process. The CCP, China's government, currently tolerates Apple operating in the country and not other Western companies like Facebook, Google, because it reinvests so much cash into China's economy, factories and other growth engines. So if Apple was to move all of its factories outside of China and rather than reinvest that cash, it just tried to withdraw it from the country, why would there be any reason for the government to tolerate Apple? There would be none. At present, I believe that Apple is effectively a useful hostage for China. It can't really leave, but at the same time, China gains a lot from Apple having such a large presence in the country. Just look at this tweet where somebody from the CCP uses the reception in China of Apple to condemn the treatment of TikTok in America. As a prized hostage of the CCP, Apple basically has to do anything that Beijing tells it to, at least in China proper. So Apple recently, or last year, banned HKMap.live. It was a maps app that protesters in Hong Kong were using to mark the location of different police units and allow other free speech protesters to avoid them. They also limited file sharing on iPhones in China after there were anti-government protesters using AirDrop to basically bypass internet filters in order to spread documents and leaflets that were critical of the CCP. That's what you saw the journalist at the start of the video criticizing Tim Cook on. Now, Tim Cook is very outspoken outside of China on civil liberties and privacy, but in China, he effectively acts in the exact opposite way, which, is very hypocritical. Tim Cook talks about civil liberties and privacy, laudable sentiments irrelevant in China, where Apple has no choice but to deliver the data of its Chinese customers to the government. Unwillingly, perhaps, Apple has become a facilitator of surveillance and government censorship. Because Apple is a prized hostage of the CCP at present, I personally don't think that there is any chance that the government will do anything to actively damage Apple's prospects in the country as of yet. I do worry there is a small chance that the country's actions on the international stage, such as invading Taiwan, could potentially destroy Apple. But personally, I assign the chance of that being extremely minuscule. I think there's just too much interdependence between China and the US for China to just completely collapse its own economy, etc., just on the off chance of being able to conquer Taiwan. So because I assign that such a low probability, I am invested in companies like Alibaba or Apple. But I do think that if you assign the chance of that happening as being very high, you probably should not be invested in Apple. I hope you found this video useful in any case, and if you did, please give me a like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.